Our final session this morning is a panel discussion, and I have the honor and privilege to monitor this discussion between Dr. Beth Ulrich, Dr. Richard Kohn, Dr. Martin Cook, and Dr. James Burk on the subject of ethics in civil military relations. But before we get into that, Dick Kohn wanted to relate an anecdote, so I'll give the floor to Dick.
I was just going to end my comments with a story that illustrates, I think, what this whole session is designed to do, as Martin put it, which was to raise these issues of the ambiguity and the complexity of this, and how senior people are put in such impossible situations. It's a true story of the chairman of the Joint Chiefs asked his legal advisor, an Army colonel who taught for many years at the Army War College, what would happen if the president ordered me to tell Congress, or what happens if in testifying before Congress, which by the way is a way in which military officers can make their views known to the nation, if they asked me a question that the president had ordered me specifically not to talk about or answer, particularly in front of the Congress. And Zane Finkelstein replied, "Well, General, you clutch your chest, roll your eyes, and fall out of your chair. And when you hear the door close on the chairman's suite at Walter Reed, you open your eyes and you get out of bed and you go over to the red phone and you pick it up and you say, Mr. President, I will not perjure myself before the Congress of the United States. Please give me new orders."
And with that, okay, the format that we'll use for this panel will consist of a series of questions that first I will pose to the panelists and get some response from them. And they can, I'll make it open to any of them to answer the questions that I pose. And then at the end of that time, I'll open up the floor for all of you to then ask questions with the time that we have remaining. So we'll get started. For over 50 years, the Naval War College has been a place where strong personal relationships have been forged between U.S. and international officers. Those relationships matured over time, and on numerous occasions we have witnessed instances where, for example, a U.S. officer has picked up the phone to call an international counterpart to resolve an issue between two friends that has avoided a serious international incident. In 2007, a cooperative strategy for 21st century sea power was published that called for, among other things, expanding cooperative relationships with other nations that will contribute to the security and stability of the maritime domain for the benefit of all. It goes on to say that although our forces can surge when necessary to respond to crises, trust and cooperation cannot be surged. They must be built over time so that the strategic interests of the participants are continuously considered while mutual understanding and respect are promoted. These relationships, therefore, will be personal relationships where the on-scene commander's situational awareness, coupled with the trust and cooperation forged between partners, will guide his judgment and decision-making. My question for the panel is thus: what are the ethical implications for civil-military relations under this new strategy when the situation in theater calls for decisions by the military commander that may be at odds with U.S. administration policy?
Okay, looking at the overall security cooperation strategies, which all services have them, and we're all out there to build relationships with other services, and it is the theater commander's job to, oversee that, and we've all got our plans for doing that. I think of a good way to approach this might be with an anecdote from Admiral Fallon's experience when he was at CENTCOM, and he did have, apparently in the end, it's one of the reasons why he decided he couldn't serve anymore in that capacity, disagreement over what was evolving in Washington with regard to speculation, really, about a future Iran policy. I mean, nothing that had been stated yet. And he was a bit outspoken about this, and in this final article that did him in was when he gave an interview to Thomas Barnett, who you may know because he actually came from here. He was the guy who wrote the Pentagon's new map while he was serving at the Naval War College, right? That's when all that started. And then after he got away from all that and was doing this sort of freelance reporting, but anyway, got him to be on record against the policy. So that, of course, I think was crossing some sort of line in terms of speaking out that way. But what would have been completely legitimate, and something he actually complained about in the article, was to do his job, going to the various countries, meeting with the leaders, and forging the personal relationships. I mean, there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, the question is, what do you do when you're in those meetings? It's one thing to forge a relationship and to update about what the policy is. It's something else to say, well, I have a different view on what may be going on in Washington. And if he's doing that, then I think that would be inconsistent with the norm of the civilians get the set policy, and he shouldn't even be inappropriately influencing the policy. But I think he overstated the case in the article when he says, well, they're saying I shouldn't even go to these places. Well, no, you should go to these places. He just happened to be that in his region, they were, not the most friendly places and countries you weren't on the best terms with, but it was still important to engage those actors. So I think I would leave it at that. And in his case, the problem may have been conflating some of these responsibilities. And if he understood a little bit more, specifically how these roles and responsibilities break down, shouldn't have had such a conflict with doing his job as the commander and executing the security cooperation strategy, and then somehow separating that from inappropriately influencing and evolving policy.
I think Fallon's case is interesting for a couple of reasons besides that one. Rick's pretty well documents in Gamble that Fallon was no supporter of Petraeus' strategy. So that you had this conflict where Fallon is clearly the theater combatant commander, the regional combatant commander, and clearly has authority over Petraeus, but Petraeus is running his own back channel directly to the White House, which basically cut Fallon out of the action. So.
Let's think about a medical doctor, which Martin did earlier. And you have, as a medical doctor, a personal relationship with your patient. Your patient has an illness, and there are 3 different options for treating this illness. And there may be personal reasons for choosing option A or B or C, but there's no real difference in the literature to help you decide which of these options is the best. It's, I won't say a matter of taste, but it certainly is a matter of judgment. It's not a matter of medical judgment, it's a matter of personal judgment. Now suppose this doctor failed to notify or to fully inform his patient that these other options were available because this doctor's own preference was to do option A, not option B or C. Well, I would say that that doctor was acting in a way which was inappropriate. And imposing the power of a personal relationship into a situation where that power was not relevant. Now, if we have a case where personal relations in the conduct of international affairs or something like this may influence the outcome of a policy, I think we have to say that those personal relationships are inappropriately used. Personal relations may make government work, but they're not the basis of government. Government is a structure, and the structure has to be create channels through which personal relationships can work. If those personal relationships are deep and effective, then government may work more easily. But they cannot be the basis on which policy is made or implemented, either domestically or in international affairs. Speaking so categorically.
I would agree with what's said. Admiral Fallon and others hold positions of trust, held positions of trust under the United States government. They were representatives of that government. No matter what the personal relationships are, they have to execute the policy of their superiors. They just have to do it in such a way that it's honest without dissembling. They can explain to their friends in foreign governments what's going on and why it's going on. But I think anyone who works for a large organization knows that they are put often or sometimes in the position of having to either execute policies or decisions they don't agree with, and sometimes even to represent them to the public and to their friends. I'm reminded of a conversation I had once at a professional meeting when, having lunch with some strangers, this man from the University of California, Davis, said to me, "Will you work for the Air Force? How do you justify," and then he had a long list of issues with the United States Air Force. This was in the mid-1980s. And I said, "Wait a second, I work for the Air Force. I'm the chief of their history program, but I'm not responsible for all those policies." "Oh," he said, "yes, you are. You are the representative of the Air Force, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera." And I said, "Well, all right. You're a member of the faculty of UC Davis." I said, I will answer your question if after that you tell me how you can work for," he asked me how I could work for an institution that could do this, "how you can work for an institution that had created all these pesticides and herbicides and was responsible for so much agricultural devastation in the state of California," and on and on and on about UC Davis's agriculture school. And a third member sitting at the table and said, "I think we should move on to a different topic."
Okay, question 2. What do you see as the single biggest ethical issue facing military leaders with respect to civil-military relations today?
Politicization.
I knew that was in trouble.
Okay, now we actually got a heads up at dinner that this one was going to be coming. And I said, "Oh, don't tell me what the question is because I don't want to have to think about it." And I thought, well, I will want to elaborate on that point in a minute. But I think in general, it's a combination of things. It's no one single thing, and it all goes back to an overall lack of understanding of these roles and responsibilities, for whatever reason. I mean, I think on the military side, even though we have this vast professional military education system, we don't use it to develop these competencies with as great effect as we should. I mean, I think there is not, the constitutional foundations aren't what they should be. But the good news is we can fix that. I think we can recognize, and we can, because we have a system, hopefully over time, to work on that. What's harder to get at is the professional norms part. If you remember Tuesday, a lot of what we talked about, the behaviors we could bring back to the Constitution, and some of it we had to say, it's more about officership and how you manage the profession. And I think some of these issues that we've been talking about the last few days, the profession needs to sort of step in and solidify whatever the norm is. Like for instance, with regard to the retirees or not. I mean, people were really doing their own thing for a while. It wasn't until recently that Admiral Mullen stepped in and said, he issued some guidance and said, stop it. He was the first chairman to do something like this. So in general, and if we get into trouble, it's going to be because of a certain degrading of the perfect storm of not understanding the responsibilities as it plays out over time. I mean, Iraq War maybe is an example of that. Congress not stepping up to its responsibility, the professional responsibility to advise not being as followed as strongly as it could have. Meanwhile, the overreach on the executive side, saying, yes, you can do that under the Constitution, but is that really the way to forge a civil-military partnership to get the best results in national security? So when it breaks down, at every point that it could, you could get some really bad outcomes like I think we have. And that's why I think we've, working so hard to show you that it is complex, so there is no simple thing. And I'll just say one more thing about the partisanship bit, and because I think this is important, and I try to think what can I impress at you at this point in your development, and I think I have an opportunity with you that I don't have with my more senior War College people who are a little bit more set in their ways, and that is to, as you're now in these stages, another decade perhaps before you get to those jobs where you'll perhaps be in these advisory roles, how are you preparing yourself for those jobs? I mean, this year is going to prepare you a lot. You're going to get, a good political strategy education in general. But when it comes to civil military norms, what do you, and if you find yourself at one end of the political spectrum, do you feel that you can be objective as you move up and advise? Do you see that you have certain ideological preferences that could perhaps bias your advice? What do you read? What we see is what happens in our discourse is a subset of what happens in our overall political discourse. And in our country, I would say it's not in a great place right now. It's not really discourse. It's polarization, and it's fighting over things, and we don't really have policy debates. So at some point, when you get up there and you're going to be advising on some aspect of this policy debate, you're going to be able to do that as an objective military advisor and not someone who's captive of one or another viewpoint. And so, I just challenge you this year. You're going to have time to read and reflect, and you'll be exposed to a range of sources. Just be open-minded. What are some good sources that you can turn to that can help you to be objective and balanced and apply your critical thinking skills. So as you develop these political competencies, you'll be in a good place down the road to advise. So that's just my 2 cents.
I agree with Martin and Mary Beth. If you like a one-word answer or a multi-word answer, these are both good answers to pay attention to. I'm kind of curious to know, it just occurred to me as I was listening to Mary Beth, I don't know the answer to this question. Where did the phrase civil-military relations come from? When was that coined? How old? How far back does it go? Maybe, Dick, you're a historian. Maybe you know. But one thing we can say about the phrase, if we think about it for just a little minute, is that it implies that there's a binary relationship. There's a dyad at work. Elliot Kohn talked about an unequal dialogue, as if it were between two people. There's the civilian power, there's the military power, and they're talking to one another. But as we conceive of that now, it's the military talking with the president. What's the relationship between the military and the president or the executive branch? And this seems to me an indicator of a problem that maybe you shouldn't be thinking about too deeply as officers and part of your professional education, but we civilians ought to be thinking about. That is, what kind of context have we created for serving officers to enable them to enact the norms of their profession in a way which is fully effective? I think if we focus on the binary relationship being between the military and the executive branch, we're bound to have friction and trouble, and the relationship is bound to be brittle. It's a marriage, yes, but it's a troubled marriage, and there's no way around it. I think if it would be easier to accomplish the tasks of a professional, teaching a professional military ethic, if the dialogue was more centered on the relationship between the executive branch and the legislative branch. Now, you may think that's hopelessly naive of me, and I may agree with you. But that doesn't mean that the statement is wrong just because it's naive. If Congress is more engaged in an effective way to determine what our policies should be when those policies have as a consequence the introduction of the country to war, then the policy is vetted with the American people, and officers who feel like a president's policy may not be the thing that the people would choose if they were fully informed. If a military officer didn't feel like the American people were being manipulated, but there had been a real dialogue, then I think the outcomes could be different. Now, that said, that's what a civilian should be worrying about. When we think about how you promote the single biggest problem for professional military ethic today, then I'm back to Martin. Politicization. Stop it. Stop it. Do what Dick says.
Well, I certainly agree with my colleagues. I would divide it into, well, my short answer is ignorance and unreadiness for the relationship. That is the chief problem. And on the civilians, I would divide it into the civilian side and the military side. The civilian politicians, both in the executive and legislative branch, are not prepared for the conflict between their short-term political interest, their personal ambition, and their longer-term responsibilities for leadership in the United States government. It's a conflict, frankly, that politicians, it seems to me, face at every stage of their career, but they're usually more knowledgeable about the issues and the people involved than they are about civil-military relations, the military history, and national security. But they're simply ignorant and unready. On the military side, the same problem obtains. And it's not that they don't have some experience in civil-military relations, because almost always they do. They've served in Washington, they've observed it. They usually have, as we used to say, a gimlet eye at the dealings of politicians. American officers have distrusted and disliked the Congress since the beginning of the Republic, because it often, as a group does, political group acts in what they consider to be irrational terms, and they don't trust presidents very much either. But I think senior officers are unprepared for the conflict between their duties and their responsibilities, their loyalties, and they feel very strongly their loyalty to the Constitution and to the political leaders that have been elected or appointed to supervise them, their personal ambitions, and the voices that they hear when they become chiefs of their service or combatant commanders. The voices of the retired officers, the voices that are welling up from their commands, the voices of the historic figures. There is no Chief of Staff of the Air Force who doesn't hear the voice of Billy Mitchell and Hap Arnold. I doubt there's any Chief of Naval Operations that doesn't hear the voice of Arleigh Burke or Chester Nimitz. All of these voices are in their heads, and all of them relate to their duties and their responsibilities, and they are often in conflict with their orders and the policies and the situations that they're in. Ron Fogelman told me that he had no problem being a commander of Military Airlift Command, because if there was a problem in his command, he took care of it. Problem in other commands, he'd help if he could, but he wasn't responsible. But when he became Chief of Staff of the Air Force, every single thing that happened in the Air Force was his responsibility. And he felt at a loss, almost powerless to take care of that responsibility adequately in his own mind. And so I think they're not prepared for these things. And so it's, I say, ignorance and unreadiness.
Thank you. Okay, now, at the risk of getting a one-word answer, Martin, I'll ask this third question. Is there a scenario of such national importance that actions of military officers may require them to act outside of the ethical boundaries of civil-military relations?
Let me start, since my button's on. They do every year when the combined federal campaign comes to them. But the answer is yes, if they're willing to essentially commit professional suicide. But I think I can't think of an instance where that would be possible unless they've decided that an insane commander-in-chief has ordered them to loose nuclear weapons in some way that could be called legal. But short of that, I don't think so.
I think I'll give you one-word answer again. It's no, but as a philosopher, we've got to look at how you phrase the question, right? The way you phrased the question was, there a scenario in which you would have to act outside the ethical constraints of civil-military relations? And the answer to that, I think, is no. But what we've been talking about is the ambiguity about what exactly those ethical constraints are. So, my grudging argument for the revolt of the generals was that policy was failing so badly and had been so poorly conceived, and that these were not just any old general officers picked up to appear on CNN. These were officers who came immediately from the fight, who spoke with authority about how bad it was, and with great fear and trembling, I argued they did us a national service by saying so. Now, I think I still hold that view, but the fears about that argument are obvious. You certainly don't want to create a permission that any time there is disagreement with policy, that permission stands open. So you have to make a kind of argument for extreme cases, supreme emergencies, big outliers, and you have to assume that people have the judgment to know that this disagreement is not such an emergency. And I worry about that, because that permission, the tendency is going to be to think that everything you feel strongly about is an emergency of that order, and most of them, in retrospect, are not going to turn out to have been. So it's a bit of a muddle. That's why Dick's clarity is appealing to me, even though I think I'm not prepared to go there absolutely unambiguously.
Okay, on this one, I'd say if you're talking about compromising norms rooted in a constitutional foundation, I'd say there's no, I cannot think of any scenario if it means going around that. And so that's going to be situations more rooted in civilian control issues. And I think something else we haven't really talked about these past few days is that often when there was a resort to going outside the norms, again, because of the ignorance and unreadiness, they didn't realize there was a play in the playbook that could have been effective within the norms. Okay, so for instance, this is my theme about how I think the whole Congress piece is just underplayed. Before you go, how many times have we had officers go, outside the norms to the New York Times or to write their foreign affairs article or something like that before they went to Congress? So I think we have a lot of work to do first just on, what is the legitimate playbook for staying within the norms? And, because I bet in most cases, if you had played every play, you would have achieved some progress. But it's this short circuiting that goes on. There's this impatience, or whatever it is, that gets people in trouble. So,
let me just comment on that, because I just want to foot stomp that for a minute. Mary Beth and I published a piece together a couple of years ago, pointing out that one of the most frequent misunderstandings in this area that I encounter among officers is their belief that because the president is the commander-in-chief, that they work for the executive branch. And we've hit this off and on throughout the conference, but I just want to come back full circle to it. I've only semi-jokingly suggested we replace the wall of photos out there with the president, a picture of the president, the Congress, and the Supreme Court on the top row. But I think that would be a very effective reminder of who you really work for, and that's unpleasant because it's complicated. It means you work for 3 entities, and those entities themselves are not unitary, so it's complicated.
Martin, that runs the risk. I agree with you. I'd love to see it there, but it runs the risk of confusing officers, and so it might be the occasion for some very good instruction about the way in which these relationships work and the way in which the relationships with the 3 branches differ.
Well, it might, but you know, it also, I still run into people who think Ollie North is a hero. You know, and Ollie North's response, remember, for violating a number of federal laws was, well, if the President of the United States told me to stand on my head in the corner, I'd do it. And if you got a lieutenant colonel who thinks that's the way he should understand his professional ethic, we're seriously in trouble.
Well, and in that case, it was so serious because they were circumventing a law.
Yes.
I mean, that whole operation was about going around the law with, you know, what was the Helmsburg, whatever, you know, to prevent the selling of arms. And the other half of my question would be, okay, on a constitutional basis, I really don't see how you can rationalize that without undermining, you know, the system itself, which the oath was not to do that. So I don't see how you can justify that. I think the whole moral dilemma stuff comes into play more, things that are more purely on kind of the officership and other aspects of the norms, not necessarily, you know, covered 100% by the Constitution. And those tend to be these trust issues, that those tend to have to do with, you know, having an effective civil-military partnership and falling on your sword that way or not. And so that goes back to managing the profession and all that sort of thing. So.
Huntington in The Soldier in the State, early on in the book, poses the question, what should the soldier do if the soldier is given an order to commit genocide? And Huntington says, this is a really tough one. As a person, I want to be able to say, I can disobey that order. I can ignore it. Put it aside. This is beyond the pale. But as an officer, I have to follow the order if it's gone through the lawful chain of command, even though I personally might think genocide is abhorrent. Well, what do we do? Huntington says, as a man, he was writing in 1957, one would have to object. As an officer, one would have to obey and put one's personal feelings aside. I am deeply troubled by that answer. I can't believe it. I can't believe that that's true. I can't believe that it would conflict with my duties as a professional soldier to find such an order, one that deserves my disobedience. But, oh, I say this with fear and trembling. I have attempted sometimes to write about this in print. It is so difficult. It is so easy to slip. And then it's so hard when other people use your words and then try to interpret what you've said in a way that allows more latitude and leniency than I certainly ever intended. I think this issue about genocide is one of those supreme cases where one really does have to stand on one's conscience and take the consequences, whatever they might be. And that obedience to orders has to be the normal course of affairs, the thing that we first do. But we cannot be so obedient that we suspend critical thought. Cannot be so disobedient that we will just do anything that someone tells us because it's gone through a formal legal vetting. But remember, this is an argument in extremis. This is an argument about an order to do genocide. This is not about whether to go into Iraq or what the proper strategy should be in Afghanistan. In these cases, obedience is required for all the reasons we've said.
Just to add very briefly, I think when one talks about civil-military relations, one can never, in pretty extreme situations, one must remember the situation that Count von Stauffenberg faced in the 1940s. And I raised that with a German colonel at a conference in Garmisch when we were talking to former members of parliamentarians from former communist countries, and his response was, "We won't bring that up." And I think that it's only in the hypothetical of extremity, as Jim has explained, that you bring it up. But these things, can be much less threatening. For example, the entire U.S. Armed Forces carried out the executive order to incarcerate over 100,000 Japanese Americans in 1942 from the West Coast in camps in the mountain states. And that was a legal order, and it was an order that was confirmed by the Supreme Court in 1944. But in retrospect, it was a terrible thing to do and a terrible mistake and unnecessary. The United States government has apologized for it and has made amends for it. But I think it was perfectly proper for the American Armed Forces to carry out that order.
That's a wonderful example. I think it shows that if the military had disobeyed that order, it would have been far worse for the military and for the preservation of our government. So I think that's a wonderful example to pose counter to mine. Let's do another one. And I really I would prefer not to be talking about this at all, John. I hold you responsible. But here we are. Now, apparently, Congress passed a law prohibiting torture. We had a president who got legal opinions saying that certain acts which are customarily thought of as torture either aren't torture or we can do them. Now, a soldier gets an order to torture in the ordinary sense of the word. What is the soldier to do? Is this a lawful order or not? The president, it's the law of the land. The president says, well, I can interpret the law and the Constitution as I wish. And the president and the Congress don't agree about what the law is. How is a soldier or a sailor, an officer, to understand what is a lawful order? This is a real dilemma.
It is a real dilemma. I think in that case, a reasonable person could go either way. The question would be, which law are you relying upon? Are you relying upon your understanding that a ratified treaty has the same status as any other American law, and the treaties prohibiting torture are ratified treaties? Or are you going to rely on John Yu's opinion? And I think a person could responsibly say, yes, I know that's what White House legal counsel is saying, but it would take a fairly legally sophisticated soldier to make this argument, but say, this in the end is a legal opinion that is quite an outlier in terms of the history of the interpretation of this question.
And wasn't this also a good news civil military relations story to the point where, wasn't it the military JAGs that were the ones who were involved in defending all of the detainees in this, who pushed back against what was going on?
Well, they did,
on the civilian side.
But they did it in a way that's arguably pretty ethically dubious. They went to the New York Bar Association and said, please sue us.
I think of the soldiers under Lieutenant William Calley in 1969 at the little town of My Lai. I don't know exactly what they were ordered to do, But I think it's even more extraordinarily difficult to wonder what your ethical responsibilities are, having witnessed something of that sort, to report it, and then what your ethical responsibilities are once that report up the chain of command in the Americal Division simply disappeared. And the young man, the helicopter pilot, I guess he was, or crewman, who brought it to the attention of the press, he leaked. Yeah, I mean, these things are not just at the level of 4 stars and governments. I doubt in the scenario you've set up, Jim, that someone would be kind of ordered to torture. It's even more ambiguous when they say, make these people talk. We need actionable intelligence and we need it now. And the contractors over in the next room aren't available. So you are under the UCMJ, and so I mean, it's maybe you clutch your chest and fall out of the chair. I don't know. I don't know the answer to these things.
All right, my last question, and then we'll turn it over to the audience here. But for these mid-grade officers and civilian students here in the auditorium, what can they look forward to in the evolution of civil-military relations?
I think this is a realistic hope. I think we're making a lot of progress getting the conversation about the profession going in all the services. I see real possibility of reinvigorating the professionalism conversation, and I think the officers before us right now are the people to do it. I think in some ways Don Snyder has done the country a great service by kicking off that conversation, and I just hope we can continue it at all of our command staff colleges and war colleges.
I agree. I think all of us here have, our professional focus has been on this, and I hope we think we're making a little bit of progress. But it needs to be, I'd say, still more systematized. I had several students come up after Tuesday and say, well, that's great what you talked about, but what about the civilian side? I feel there's not enough thinking done on this whole preparation of the civilian side, and there's got to be some opportunities there to work on that. So I think there is progress, just by shining light on something at the professional schools to try to fix the military side, the professional norms piece, and then for those of you in that sphere to realize a professional responsibility, especially on the officership side, to educate the other sphere as best you can. So when they do overreach and they do try to politicize, and sometimes naively so, it may be appropriate to push back and say, well, it's because of my norms of my profession, maybe it's not the best idea that I go on that talk show, or that I shouldn't be a prop for this, or I shouldn't be this, or especially for this politicization piece, to maybe push back and do some little mutual educating as far as that goes. I think we need to do more on the civic education side for all the actors involved to get to the constitutional piece. So I think you have to look forward to maybe being the ones rising up in the profession, and by the time this all comes together, you'll be in those leadership roles, because it's got to be the leaders of the profession that set the example and the expectations for what they want to have. And the other thing I'd say we have to look forward to is that it's just going to get more complex. It's not, as Jim Burk was saying, it's, already it's oversimplified, I think, somewhat in the literature with this binary, this and that, but this, the nature of the strategic environment. There's so many more actors involved. I think we need to look more at an interagency application of these principles. There's going to have to be military advice throughout the interagency, starting with state. Where else do we need it? State, who's that military advisor to the Secretary of State? She needs somebody just like Chairman of the Joint Chiefs. And how do they interact? I mean, I think there's somebody there. There's some people, there's some roles who do that. What about Homeland Security? What about, whatever else you need? So there's an interagency piece. And of course, everything we do now is in coalition. So, what needs to be done within an alliance, across countries, all these kinds of things. So I think we're just kind of starting to think about those things as well.
I don't really have any strong predictions here. I'm a sociologist, and believe me, there's nothing like being a sociologist to make you humble about your capacity to make decisions. We're supposed to be a predictive science, and I've been in it now for many decades and haven't been able to predict anything yet. And now we're just talking about relations among my wife and children. Imagine something more complicated, like the evolution of civil-military relations over your time. I think there is ground for being relatively optimistic, guardedly optimistic. We have, as a positive trend, the institutional developments. There seems to be a kind of awareness among the various services about the importance of professional ethics. And not only that, but while there are some people who would like to take a kind of kindergarten approach to it, I think there are more people within the defense establishment who want to take a more serious and critical look at it. What really are the limits of the profession? When can those limits be crossed or stretched, or when should we stay far away from them because they're as dangerous as, oh, now I'm way out of my field. What are those electrical wire things you're not supposed to touch because they kill you? Yes, limits like that, right. So I'm encouraged by that, but that won't work well. Junior officers on their way up are not going to pay much attention to that, no matter how serious the discourse, if the senior officers at the highest levels, to include the level of retirement, don't set an example which embodies those limits that we talk about in professional military education.
Well, I agree, particularly about the retirement, because when I retire from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, I'm suddenly not going to engage in plagiarism. My professional norms carry with me the rest of my life, and I guess I would use the title. I don't use general, but I use doctor. But I agree with my colleagues. I would say, what do you have to look forward to is this: if you're successful. And if you're lucky, you can look forward to being surprised and look forward to the unexpected. That being the case, I think you have to prepare yourself for the surprise and the unexpected. You're given a foundation like any education from college and command and staff and then War College, but it's only a foundation. You have to apply it. And furthermore, you have to educate yourselves beyond what we call in the military the schoolhouse, because you won't be prepared unless you do. Unlike any other profession, you don't practice your profession daily and yearly the way we do in our other professions. Every time you rise in rank and have a different job, it's like, in some respects, having a new part of your profession that you've never done before. The heart surgeon that you go to, and I hope you never have to, has done hundreds or even thousands of heart surgeries. Your command of a ship or of a brigade or of a division, you've never done before it happens to you in war. And so you have to prepare yourself by self-educating yourselves beyond the schoolhouse, and that goes particularly for civil-military relations if, as I say, you're lucky enough and successful enough to ever be put in these situations.
Thank you very much. I'd like to open up the questioning now in the time that we have remaining, and I would ask you please to use the microphones. And you can either address your question to a specific panel member or to the panel at large. So let me put on my glasses so I can see folks. I got you. I got it. In the back. Push the button.
There we go. Oh, great. Lieutenant Commander Longman, United States Navy. This is to no one particular on the panel. the click of the mouse, a concept of operations can be sent through the chain of command to our elected and appointed civil leaders almost immediately and 24/7 through our robust ISR network. Civil leaders can observe Kill TV, not only to watch, but sometimes make actual tactical decisions to strike and sometimes question those operations prior to their conclusion. Could you please discuss the impacts that technology has had on the civil-military relations and some of the ethical implications of them?
Well, I think that the technology has been affecting command relationships ever since the introduction of the telegraph and of semaphores and radio, and we're on a continual moving belt, and it seems to me that the military has to adjust and also to educate its civilian leaders as to what is proper not to interfere with. We have many examples of that. When an F-4 pilot launched from Florida in 1962 during the Cuban Missile Crisis, flying as F-4, you know, a voice came into his helmet that said, "This is the Attorney General of the United States, Captain." It's a Marine captain. "You tell me what you see and I'll tell you what to do." No, we don't need that. We don't want that. But in an era of nuclear weapons and the Cold War, there was great danger and fear that something might set off these things. And so I think it is inevitable in the stream of technology, at least in the short run, that senior leaders will get more and more ability to think they can, or to affect tactical decisions, and to think that they should do so. And it's up to the profession to parse these issues and understand both sides and teach the civilians how to deal with it and what's proper and what the consequences of improper civilian interference will be in tactical or operational decisions. Abraham Lincoln did it, remember, at the invasion of Norfolk in 1862, was ordering troops around. I mean, this is an old problem.
I think there's also, at a strategic level, a new dynamic. You know, so now that the theater commander who's thousands of miles away can also be, you know, on VTC in your office all the time if you want. You know, so that's, you know, it's just a new dynamic, and how they use that, and what's the difference between that and actually being there. And so all of this, you know, collaborating that goes on back and forth, different things are possible. And so at both levels, strategic, operational, you know, all levels, tactical, I think you have to figure out what's the proper balance to actually do what's possible versus what is most effective.
I like to say that virtual presence is actual absence. Virtual presence is actual absence. In other words, you're not really there.
Next
Wow,
question.
wow, that was Zen-like. You know, I'm really reluctant to talk too much about the technology of war and how it's changing. That's what you guys are really good at. But you do have to think about what are the consequences for using some technologies. Just 2 points. One, sometimes the changing technology of war argument is used to justify the concentration of power in the executive branch because the decisions have to be made so quickly that there's no time for deliberation. I think this argument is exaggerated. I don't want to make too hard and fast a distinction between offensive operations and defensive operations, but it's true that the possibility exists if we're under sudden attack that we have to undertake some sudden actions of self-defense. And I don't wish to deny that, and I hope you guys are maintaining some kind of capability in this area. I'm counting on that. But on the other hand, as I think about the wars we've entered over most of the period since the end of the Second World War, I can't think of too many cases, Korea may be one, exception to that rule, but otherwise there's been time for deliberation. The question is, do we take time to deliberate when we have time for deliberation, technology of war or not? I think we can't, we easily argue that the technology of war has changed so much that we no longer have time to deliberate. I think that's a false argument. That's one point. Second point, the technology of war, particularly drones, seems to me to affect our relationship with one another as professionals and our relationship with the enemies that we face and confront, or don't fail to confront, just watch them on a television screen. We were talking about this question over dinner last night, and maybe some folks at the dinner came to a conclusion. I'm still uncertain. It strikes me that the more depersonalized our relationship is with the enemy, the harder it is for us to maintain our professional integrity. And the harder it is for us to maintain a relationship with the enemy that allows us to be friends with the enemy when the conflict is over. That may sound like a fairy tale, but it's part of just war theory as I understand it, that one ought to engage in war in a way that allows for the possibility of peace in the end.
Question in the back.
Good morning, Lieutenant J.P. Mantone, U.S. Navy, with a question for Dr. Kohn regarding resignations, and I'll paraphrase you the best I can, sir. But you stated that one resignation would be, quotes, a resignation, but all 6 of the Joint Chiefs resigning would be a revolution. To me, that's a strange sort of revolution. Usually when the military rebels, it has a name, and it's called a coup. There's bloodshed. The military actually supplants the government, as we've seen recently in both Honduras and in Thailand. I can't think of a more principled way for the senior leadership, especially all 6 acting in unison, to demonstrate their opposition to an administration's seriously flawed policy without disobeying orders, undermining it through back channels, or going back on their commissioning oaths. I'd like to get your thoughts on that, sir.
When I was growing up an amateur sailor in Lake Michigan, we used to recite the ditty of "There goes old J.D. McFay, who died defending his right of way." And I think it's not a revolution, it is a revolt. And I think you have to think through the consequences of what would happen if, is likely to happen if all 6 of the Joint Chiefs were to exercise their principles. And I wonder whether they are chosen for their principles or whether they are chosen for their professional competency, and whether their principles should be vetted, perhaps, by the civilian leadership, which is always concerned, as I said, about the short-term political consequences of this or that. And then they get vetted over whether they would resign, as a group, and you have absolutely no trust between the civil and the military. And so then they did do so in some kind of horrifying conflict with the president or with a law or Congress. What kind of a military would you have in the United States? Who would come forward to lead it, and how could they lead the men and women under their command? It would paralyze the United States, for better or for worse. And I think each one of those chiefs, you would have to question each one of those chiefs of whether they really did believe in civilian control of the military, and were they qualified and competent to hold the jobs that they had just voluntarily surrendered.
I think it goes to the question we began the entire conference with, which is, what does it mean to take an oath to the Constitution? And in the end, it's you're swearing loyalty to a process. That is to say, to a process of constitutional government. You're not taking an oath to good outcomes or results that you approve of, or, to be blunt, not even in the end necessarily the survival of the country. I mean, let's be clear about this. The country could go down by following constitutional processes. And in that extreme and horrible case to contemplate, loyalty to the Constitution would mean following the orders that takes it there. Now, that's harsh, but that is, I think, in the end, the real deal.
Next question, over here on the side.
That's a really great question. I'm really glad you raised it because it clarifies an ambiguity that I think I might have created. The answer to this in theory is very straightforward. You should always follow constitutionally appropriate results that go through the process, except when, in the case that's hard to contemplate, if the result was an illegal order. Because that's bright line, clear international law. If you know or reasonably believe the order to be an illegal order, you are obligated to disobey it. That's perfectly clear. Now, having said that, we don't do a very good job about preparing you to recognize an illegal order. We don't do a very good job creating mechanisms to give you any assurance whatsoever that your disobedience to an illegal order will be protected. So the consequences to you may be grave, but if you know or reasonably believe, I'm sounding lawyer-like here, that the order is illegal, you should disobey it, absolutely. Now, will the consequences for you be bad? Possibly. But I think a person of conscience has to contemplate that extreme case where that's what I have to do. Now, the problem with the Japanese relocation was it wasn't horrific as it wasn't obviously an illegal order. That is to say, I can't think of any law that it violates. It violates the rights of those people, and so I think very quickly someone would come back and one would have hoped somebody said, well, the order itself should be reviewed, but these would be legal and congressional processes to say this is a violation of the rights of American citizens. We shouldn't be doing this. But I can't think of a thing that would make it illegal. Unlike the genocide order, which would be an order to do something which is clearly illegal. So I think that's where I would try to weave among those buoys.
Question right here.
Lieutenant Commander Lauren Romeus, United States Navy. One of the themes that has come up today and before is that civilians have the right to be wrong. Civilians in leadership have the right to be wrong. And by implication, that military professionals have the duty and obligation to obey their orders, even if those orders are wrong. Based on the question that was brought up here and some of the other things, I wonder if we could more clearly define what we mean by wrong. Do we mean simply pursuing a strategy that is not likely to meet its goals, or do we mean something that is morally and ethically incorrect, even though it may be legal, even though it may not violate any laws?
Let me draw your attention to, I'll get a copy for you if you like. There's a very fine article that is in an anthology the Naval Academy uses by Marine Colonel Rausch called How to Disobey a Legal Order or something like that. No, it's called Constitutional Ethics, but this sometimes that. So we've got a category, one category that's in theory bright line, right? You're given an order that's illegal. In theory, the answer to that's clear. You shouldn't obey it. You've got orders that are legal, but you think are unwise, foolish, misguided, some other thing. Those you should obey. There's a third category, which is this order is legal, and it's. But I think that for me personally to follow it would be so morally abhorrent that I don't think I can bring myself to do it. Now, let's hope those cases are few and far between. But Colonel Rausch argues, in that extreme unpleasant condition, you may conclude there's a matter of conscience. That's what you need to do. But he runs through a little decision tree, actually, about how you would think about this. I mean, you really want to fall on your sword over this? If you're going to do it, he says it won't do to evade it or shirk it or claim you had bad comms and you didn't understand it. You need to say clearly to whoever gave you this order, I'm not going to do it, and here's why, and realize the consequences to you are probably going to be pretty severe. So is it possible that an officer could find him or herself in that circumstance? Unfortunately, yes.
Martin, can I ask you, is it possible for officers to prepare themselves for those situations, even in hopes that they'll never occur, by asking themselves whether their moral and ethical behaviors fall within the range and understandings fall within the common range of their societies, such that they make certain that when faced with a situation of that sort, their moral and ethical and professional views are within the kind of the range of the norm, so that they won't react at the moment, since they may have no real time to consider this, and whether they can prepare themselves by reading military history to see how other people at other times have faced these dilemmas. Because it's liable to come down, if it ever does come down, very quickly with almost no time to consider, and people's lives will be at stake, or perhaps even the nation's well-being. And so perhaps this is another one of those instances in which officers have to prepare themselves outside the schoolhouse for higher command and responsibility in this way.
Let me just give you one more angle on the civilians have a right to be wrong thing. Because I think we throw this term around, and I think maybe it means different things to different people, but the one way it could be thought about is, from the military's point of view, the civilian was wrong. So I think we use this phrase often when what we're really saying is the civilian decided something that the military advised something else. So obviously you would have thought that your recommendation was the right thing to do. They decided something else. But there's a lot of times when they actually turn out being right. Okay, so so when we think about these things, you have to think about the different competencies that these different spheres have, and you may not be in a position necessarily to know, based on you can say from the perspective of your professional military advice, from everything you're supposed to feed into that decision, this is what you would like to happen. And they decide something else, but they have to think of everything. I think we think of the example, we already heard a great example, the North African example with Marshall. And, is it all played out in the whole great scheme of things and the whole, complex strategy? The civilian actually was right. I mean, another example may be what went on. I use this sometimes with an early indication of where Obama is on his civil military relations readiness or not. But in the campaign, I thought he showed some good instincts when he was on his visit to Iraq and he had a meeting with General Petraeus. And of course, it's super scrutinized on the 24/7 news cycle, and everybody knew that Petraeus was giving him some briefing about don't leave on this timeline or whatever. That it was something other than what he was campaigning on. And so he came back after that meeting. There was a press conference, and he said, yeah, we had this meeting, and the press knew there was some disagreement. And of course, he's not president yet, but he's saying as the candidate, he gave me exactly, I wouldn't have changed. He advised me exactly as if I was president, it's exactly the kind of advice I wanted to get, because from his perspective of theater commander, he told me everything he needs and exactly what would have to happen to achieve this particular, strategic objective. But he says, if I become president, I have to think of everything. I have to think about the other war in Afghanistan. I have to think about the economy. I have to think about, can we sustain this politically? And, I may decide, that's an input. I will certainly make sure he knows that we got that we considered that input. And that would be a change, perhaps, from the previous administration, but, to manage that civil-military relationship, explain then why, the great scheme of things, he might actually decide something else. So this whole civilians have a right to be wrong, I mean, it's kind of loaded language, and I think you have to look at it, from what perspective. And when you're weighing in that way, it's before you know how the whole thing turns out anyway. Now, sometimes I think maybe it is obvious, there's this train wreck ready to happen, and maybe Iraq was a little bit like that. But for every situation like that, there's other situations that I think really aren't as clear.
I'd like to pick up on your point about language. We have to be aware of slogans. It sounds neat. The civilians have the right to be wrong. But the language of rights is misleading here. We're not talking about a civil right or a political right or a human right. That's not what's at stake here. We're talking about responsibility and accountability. And the civilian, the constitutionally organized political leadership, those folks are the ones who are responsible for the decisions which are ultimately made and what the outcomes of those decisions ultimately are. The military is not ultimately responsible for that. And so the military doesn't get the last word, and it oughtn't to get the last word. You're an agent of these constitutionally appointed or elected officials. Who are they accountable to? They're not accountable to me. They're not accountable to you as individuals. They're not accountable to you in the military because you have this great expertise, which you do indeed have. They're accountable to the people, we the people, because it's the people who have the sovereignty. If you say, well, this civilian doesn't have the right to be wrong in this instance, what you're saying is the people really aren't sovereign. The people of this country don't have the right to have the leaders they want. They do have the right. They might choose schmucks, but they have the right to a schmuck if that's what they want. They have that. Again, the language of rights is misleading. Think in terms of responsibility and accountability and understand that relationship as a wonderful relationship, even if your people aren't in power. It's a wonderful relationship because the leadership that we have is an outcropping of the sovereignty which we get to exercise, the fundamental freedom of our life.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question, right here in front.
Morning, doctors. Lieutenant Commander Raleigh, U.S. Navy. Thanks.
There's one in every class.
we covered a lot of topics, but I wanted to concentrate on the ethics of obeying what you deem to be an illegal order or immoral order, based on the White House's interpretation of a law, and then also the legal aspect of retired officers. And the first was, you mentioned that Dr. Kohn, that the answer is clutch your chest, fall over in your chair. And I would say that going back to the issue of torture, that would be just as unethical as doing the torture itself, because you're duty bound to not do it, and that clutching your chest and falling over is really unethical. And I wanted to get your comments on that. And for the speech of retired military officers, you touched about the legality. And it seems to me that with the revolt of the generals, why didn't they get charged with recalled to active duty and charged with Article 88s? And I get a sense that you're saying that senior military officers give up their First Amendment, and I know as active duties in the Byrd decision they do, but that we can never speak out against an administration, even in the retired status. And I would argue that the reason why they haven't been charged with Article 88s is because that would probably get to the Supreme Court really quickly to say, hey, have they checked their First Amendment rights completely for their entire lives?
On the status of retired officers, you're absolutely right. They are, because they're still drawing a salary and because they are still bearers of a commission, although retired, they are under the UCMJ. And Rick Swain from West Point published a piece in Parameters in which he argued that they should have been treated exactly as you suggest. They should have been called to active duty and court-martialed. I went to the trouble to check out with the JAGs up to a very high level what the real deal was with this. And they said, theoretically correct, but not something we would ever do and not something that is within practice. I think it's, as a practical matter, moot.
Let me add to that by saying that Article 88, as you know, says disparaging remarks. Isn't that the term? It's disparaging remarks about the President, the Secretary of Defense, or, given its 19th century origins, the governor of the state in which you are serving. And so it's very difficult to parse a disparaging remark. What is exactly disparaging? I think the generals, some of the generals certainly made disparaging remarks about the Secretary of Defense, and self-defeating ones, since I think it caused President Bush to dig his heels in and keep Secretary Rumsfeld a few more months past his time than he should have disappeared from public life. But I think it raises the larger question of the role and the legitimacy and prestige that the military has in American life. It was a point I made in my talk this morning about the political power of the military. For President Bush, even as a lame duck in his last administration, 2 years out, to have gone after these people would have been just politically impossible. For President Clinton, at the beginning of his administration, to have gone after Norm Campbell, a two-star general in the Air Force who was on active duty, who had a dining inn in Belgium, called newly elected President Clinton a pot-smoking, draft-dodging, skirt-chasing something. President Clinton knew better than to go at. Talk about disparaging remarks. Now we're really getting to something. It just isn't possible. And so I think that we have to understand that Article 88 is really designed for serving officers and enlisted, and I think it has been very rarely enforced even there, although it was raised a few times during the gays in the military business. So I think, again, to go back to the retireds, it's the issue is what professional norms are you going to choose to follow in retirement, and what professional norms are you not going to choose to follow? Now, on the subject of clutching your chest, I put that into a very specific, hypothetical, obvious clash between the two branches of government to which military officers are responsible. One, the commander-in-chief in the chain of command, and the other, the institution that makes the laws which they must obey, even if the commander-in-chief so orders something. On the subject of torture, I don't think the president ordered anybody to torture anyone. I think his administration, now I may be wrong about this, but I think his administration simply waged a coup. It corrupted the legal process by getting the legal rulings it wished from the Office of Legal Counsel, as Attorney General John Ashcroft described John Yoo as Dr. Yes. And so this all filters down the chain of command through Secretary Rumsfeld, who could be held responsible in some respects, even though I'm not a lawyer, I think, for the implementation of some of these orders. And I think it is what obligated on the part of officers and enlisted to say, I'm not going to do that. It's interesting to me that what happened at Abu Ghraib was a kind of torture that probably hadn't been thought of in the international conventions, and that's stripping people naked and then piling them on top of each other and taking their pictures. But I'm told that there were thousands or hundreds at least of other photographs of what would be called torture. So these are extreme instances, and I think the refusal of an order is a lot more possible than we tend to think here. For one thing, there are something like 3 times as many JAG officers in each of the services as there was during the Vietnam War, when the services were 3 times the size they are now. And I can think of a commander simply going and saying, well, I need a legal, I have to have my lawyer determine whether this is a legal order, and then saying to the colonel or general, take your time, make sure you're right as to when you advise me as to whether this is an order or a legal order. You know, George Marshall not often, but occasionally didn't implement an order right away because he thought it might not be a wise order. And in one instance, refused to tell the Secretary of War, came in order, and Henry Stimson ordered him to do something, and Marshall just put it away in his desk. Months later, Stimson came back and said, well, did you implement that order I did? And Marshall said, no. And Stimson said, good, that was really a dumb thing to do. I mean, you know, we are dealing with human beings in this, and you all as commanders know that. You have to use your judgment. You were recruited, you are educated, you are trained, you are experienced for your judgment. And I think in the end, we have to rely on, and you have to rely on your goodwill, your good intentions, your experience, your education, and your judgment.
Good. And with that, I'd like to thank our panel for a great discussion. I'd like to thank you all for your participation in this conference. I would especially like to thank Dr. Martin Cook, who is responsible for the content and the structure of this conference and for bringing together such a wonderful array of experts. Thank you, Dr. Cook. I want to thank the members of our War College Foundation for your support and attendance at this conference. I would like once again to thank the Van Buren Charitable Foundation for their generosity that made this conference possible. As we break now for lunch, remember there are seminars this afternoon. We have all of the content from yesterday and today to discuss. I would ask you to please check the board outside in the lobby for your seminar room assignment, because it may have changed from Tuesday. So with that, we will break for lunch, and your seminars will kick off this afternoon.